Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we want to have a discussion about modern warfare, specifically armored warfare, and the type of armored warfare that we are observing taking place in the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, a lot is different, obviously. I can tell you when I observe these pieces of content that are out there, these videos that show one, maybe two tanks operating by themselves, alone, with really no support, and maybe some infantry support that you really can't see that may exist on the battlefield, but because of the drone footage, you just can't see that element that is there. But for the most part, you do see a lot of these individual tank operations, meaning one tank or one armored infantry fighting vehicle, maybe like a Ukrainian CV-90 or Bradley. You may see a single Challenger or an Abrams or a Ukrainian T-64. You may see a Russian T-90M or a T-80 or a T-72 Bravo 3. And normally they're operating alone, which is really strange. And I know that is not. It may not be completely the norm in this conflict, and I know it's not. And I've seen video footage where you do see the Russians moving in column or line, or maybe a modified echelon formation attacking a target. And you also see some really strange things as well, in which the tanks are being used more as self-propelled artillery, and are using their main guns to engage targets that are not in direct view. They're being used as indirect fire. Now, back to my experience as a U.S. crewman on a main battle tank, an M1A1 Heavy Common. My unit operated, ironically, Marine tanks. For whatever reason, we, at the end of my military career, we ended up getting issued Marine M1 Heavy Commons. Essentially, M1A1 that had a DU, depleted uranium, a liner in the front aspect of the hull. The first tank I was on was just a regular M1A1 that ended up was a Gulf War I tank, and they had welded about an inch, maybe a half an inch of tungsten steel on the front aspect of the turret. And that had remained there. We turned those in, and then we went with the Heavy Commons. But just based on the experience that I had in the U.S. military, this picture that you can see here, a group of a platoon-sized element of 4 M1A1 main battle tanks operating in a kind of a staggered line formation. They appear to be getting ready to do some sort of gunnery exercise or what have you. And again, this is very much different in terms of terrain in which the Ukrainians and the Russians are doing battle. This is much different in terms of, again, how far you can see, and it's completely different. But at the same time, we did a lot of training in Texas, and obviously that was a little more conducive with maybe what you would see in the fields, the sunflower fields, potato fields of the Ukraine. Not exactly the same, obviously, but as you get into the winter months of Texas, not as cold. It does get rainy, does get muddy, and you do have more foliage, right, to obstruct your distance and your ability to see long distance, and some of your engagement ranges are And in terms of if you were out at NTC or in the deserts of Iraq, you're having engagement ranges out 2,000 plus meters, whereas in some cases in Texas and in other areas of Europe and Kansas and other places, your engagement ranges could be 700 meters. It just depends on kind of how the terrain is situated. But just watching the type of warfare that is taking place in terms of armored warfare, it is vastly different than what I experienced. And I can tell you that there was never, ever one occasion where a tank, a single M1A1, in my experience, would ever act independently. You always operated in a platoon-sized formation. It was always a 4-tank element. And we would do what they call bounding overwatch. 2 tanks would be moving. 2 tanks would be conducting an overwatch type scenario as those 2 tanks would move. And then the same would be if we were operating in company operations. You would have companies that would move. You had companies that would go on line formation and set as an overwatch for that company that could be moving, that 14 tank element that could be in terms of a company. Usually, we would see operations, just based on my experience, it was usually company size maneuvers. Your tank tables and stuff like that would be an individual tank operation, and then I believe it was, as I recall, your table 12 was a platoon operation of 4 tanks. But mostly, if you were training in wargaming, we would operate as a company, 14 tank company, and even then, it was pretty rare to be assigned infantry formations. Believe it or not, for whatever reason, the unit I was with, we operated solely with tanks. We very rarely would operate with Bradleys and infantry. Now, where we would see the Bradleys coming into play was our recon elements, the reconnaissance units. They were out there kind of in front of us, and they were usually the units that would engage the enemy first, and those recon units would actually rack up more kills, especially in the first Gulf War, and even some cases in the second Gulf War, than your regular line units that existed in the Army. And in my case, when I was in the military, we were not a combined arms battalion. The entire battalion was made up of main battle tanks. 4 companies of 14 main battle tanks, and that is traditionally how we operated. And we really didn't operate too much with Bradleys in terms of training. Obviously, wartime that became a little different, obviously. But again, comparing and contrasting what we are seeing now taking place in the Ukraine versus what I experienced, just completely different. You would just never see one tank operating by themselves. Never, ever, ever, ever. It just never happened. Ever. The only time you would see something like that possibly is if your tank broke down, you were having some sort of mechanical difficulty, and you were just left behind waiting for an 88 to come help you out. And that was essentially it. But most of the time, you were operating with a bunch of other tanks. When we were conducting offensive operations, it was a massed tank attack. Usually, in our view, it was about 14 other tanks operating against. We would form up on our phase line, and we would head out, and we would move, and we would not stop moving until we came upon the enemy, and then we would start engaging that enemy. But at no time would we ever really we would stop from time to time. We would come online, we would stop, if the distances in terms of where the possible enemy was and what our scouts were seeing, and we knew that our scouts were no longer in front of us and we could attack, then yeah, we would come online and we would stop. And then obviously you can shoot better non-mobile. There is this belief that I'd seen this. I believe it was a video or maybe it was a book. I don't know, but they were talking about how the M1 Abrams could actually shoot better when it was moving than when it was stationary. That's not really based on my experience. Usually the gunner could shoot better while not moving. And most of the time, just in terms of gunnery exercises, you would operate on on basically a berm. So you would pull up, you would stop, the gunner and the commander would identify their targets, and then the gunner would engage the target, usually from a stationary position. Now, we would have gunnery exercises where we were moving as well, and most of the time that was on a very well compacted road that created a very stable tank platform. Gunnery exercises, much different than real navigating over open terrain, because you got a lot more hills and bumps, and it's just completely different. And you have to have a very good driver who is listening to what's happening in the turret, knows when to slow down. When that main gun goes off, he then knows to speed up out of the smoke and dust that has been created, and then the gunner's looking for targets again. But again, completely different methodology in terms of warfare, and completely different tactics and strategy that are used when I was in the military based on what I am seeing that are taking place now in this war. Now, obviously, things have changed, right? Drones. In my experience, the United States has never been in a conflict as of yet where it would experience the type of drone nuisance that exists in the Ukraine. And it is significant. And it has changed the way this war is being fought. It is definitely changing the strategy. Another big issue in this conflict is the capability of both sides to see the movement of the other side. So if you have a large movement of forces, the U.S. intel is transmitting that information to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians know exactly where large formations of Russian troops are moving. The Russians are doing the same thing. The Russians have spy satellites. The Russians have drone intelligence. They are able to see where Ukrainian forces are moving to and from, and then can engage those forces. My experience, again, back in the early 90s, just coming out of the Cold War, we were not facing a near peer. There were some other issues, too, that were not prevalent when I was in the military to what persons in today's military are facing. So, for instance, thermal imaging optics, thermal imaging sites. In the late 80s, early 90s, the U.S., the United States, had complete and utter control over that industry. Meaning that it was very rare that we were going to, especially in Iraq, okay, that we were going to come up against an opposing unit that every piece of equipment, every tank and armored infantry fighting vehicle had thermal imaging sights. We were facing an enemy in Iraq that simply did not have thermal imaging. If I could point out to one thing that was that gave the U.S. just such a massive advantage in those conflicts, was the thermal imaging optic, both on tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. That's changing. Most adversaries today, the Chinese, the Russians, they all have thermal imaging sights now. They all have it. The Russian, the Iraqi Monkey T-72 Mike 1s, the T-62s, the T-54s, 55s, the Type 59s that the Iraqis were using, they didn't have any of that. They could not see at night, and we could. And that just led to what was essentially a massacre. And even during the day, those thermal imaging sites were used and very, very helpful. A camouflaged vehicle, even in the open desert or in a ridge line, you can see through your thermal imaging sights, and you would use them during the day or night. But again, war's changed, and it's changed dramatically, especially what we're seeing in the Ukraine. And not being there and not experiencing what the soldiers on the ground are experiencing and just hearing what is being talked about and discussed, it's really hard to get my head around what is happening in that war. I see things that take place on the ground through the use of just excerpts of videos and content, and it leaves me befuddled. And a lot of it I don't understand and I don't get, because it's so different from what I experienced in the Army and being a member of an American tank unit. And I can tell you, any tanker that existed in the 90s and is watching what is happening right now in the Ukraine, we're all scratching our heads. Because I promise you, no one understands it in terms of how tanks are being used. Because we just didn't train like that. And I think if there's a tanker out there, if there's a scout out there, if there's a Bradley guy out there, it's all the same. You're like, what is going on? Like, this isn't what warfare, in terms of how we trained, again, 80s, 90s, compared to what we're seeing now. I mean, this is more akin to World War I. I mean, crazy trench warfare. And again, technology comes into play too, and I have to question some of the technology that the Russians are using. I know that if we were, meaning we, the United States, and again, I'm talking about the time period that I was in the Army. If we knew that there was a trench line and we were fighting the Ukrainians, the war would be fought differently. It would not be fought the way it is being fought right now. But the problem is, there's different elements to this conflict right now that just didn't exist when I was in the Army. And then you have to look at the suppression of air defenses, and you have to look at the suppression of aircraft. The ability of aircraft, and especially attack helicopters, to operate in this environment. Clearly, right now, just based on the footage that I see, it is very difficult for air mobile operations and the use of attack helicopters. Usually, going back to the 90s, you would have your scouts in the front, and then you would also be joined up by H-64 Apache gunships that would be setting back, looking for targets, and engaging with their own thermal imaging devices using Hellfire missiles. But it would appear that in this conflict, in the Ukrainian conflict, it is very, very difficult to use these gunships. Both sides have very robust air defense systems. The Ukrainians have a wide array of Western systems, as do they have a wide array of Russian/Soviet systems, S-300s, Buks, what have you. And normally, based on what we experienced in war, was you could have a stable Apache platform just hovering, looking for targets. And most of the time, that aircraft would be safe. Not so in this conflict. Clearly not so. We see the Russian helicopter gunships now firing rockets and using those rockets almost in a direct fire manner. I've seen very little footage of Russian gunships using precision-guided weapons at standoff range against Ukrainian trenches. You would think, in the era that I operated from, okay, 80s and 90s, that you would see that aspect of the war, because the Russians have that technology. The Russians have the capability of what existed in the U.S. military in the 90s. The problem is they're facing a near-peer adversary that is assisting the Ukrainians, and it's very difficult for those helicopter gunships to operate. So the question is how you clear out those trenches. Well, they're clearing out those trenches now with those GLONASS guided bombs. And that's kind of what's happening. But again, just looking at tank warfare from many years ago, that when I served in the military, it is so much different than what I am seeing now. And is it the age in which the main battle tank is ending? Is the main battle tank going away? I don't think so. And here's what I think is going to happen. I think eventually, and in a very short period of time, and I think we're already starting to see that to some extent, is that electronic warfare is going to kind of overtake what is happening with drones right now. So an advanced army is going to be able to essentially cut off the ability of those drone systems. Now you have the fiber optic drone systems as well operating in this conflict, and that's going to just be another challenge to come up to overcome, and maybe it becomes more of an active protection system. Maybe you see a very designated air defense platform that operates in tandem, maybe directly behind a few dozen meters behind the actual main battle tank, to try and protect that main battle tank. I don't know what the answer is at this point, but they're going to find something. The way of war that we're seeing right now taking place in the Ukraine is too damn expensive in human life to continue this way. And eventually, they're going to find workarounds, and we'll see the new dawn of armored blitzkrieg type warfare again. Right now, it's dormant. You're not seeing it because both sides are able to see what the other side is doing, and they're able to, what they call, sense, and then they're obviously able to shoot as well and engage those targets very quickly. If we were dealing with a non-near-peer adversary, right, this war would look completely different. A lot different. But it's not. You're essentially watching and observing two sides that essentially have close to the same capabilities. Not just the Ukrainians on their own, but the support that the Ukrainians are getting from the West. If this was just the Ukrainians on their own, not receiving support from the West, this war ends. It would still be costly. You would still have an insurgency. You would still have street-to-street city fighting taking place, which is going to be costly. But I don't think you would see what's happening right now within the confines of this conflict. Again, there is a lot of technology at play in this conflict, and you don't see it, you don't hear about it too much, but it's there, and it is omnipresent, both in terms of the West helping the Ukrainians, and then obviously the technology that the Russians have. Very close to what the U.S. military has. Not in terms of the sheer size and the advanced capability of its air power. The United States definitely exceeds what the Russian capability is. Absolutely. But outside of that, some of the capabilities are very, very similar. And then I would say that the Russian kind of air defense capacity offsets any air superiority capability that the West would have. If this became a hot war, right? NATO attempting to launch air operations against the Russian Federation, you would see some very heavy losses by NATO forces. You would see losses that I don't think the West really understands as of yet. And not just in terms of the Russian air defense capability, shooting down aircraft, but rear area strikes as well. The Russians would hit these rear areas, and missiles would get shot down, but missiles would get through as well. And you would see a lot of casualties take place. But again, I'm kind of getting off the original subject that I wanted to talk about, which is just kind of armored warfare, 80s, 90s to what we're seeing right now. And again, any tanker that operated a tank in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, as they watch what is happening on the ground in the Ukraine right now, they're scratching their head. They're like, what is going on? This is craziness. One tank operating by itself. Why? What is it doing? And again, I continue to ask that question because we as a Cold War era army, a tanker in the Cold War in the early 90s, we never operated like that. It was outside the realm of our thought process to ever operate as a lone tank. You just didn't do it. You operated as a unit. You operated as a tank platoon. Well, I think I've ranted long enough. Let's hear it in the comment section. Do you agree with me, tankers out there? If there's any watching, if there's Cav Scouts out there, and you operated in the 80s and 90s compared to what you're seeing right now in the Ukraine, let's hear it in the comment section. Thanks for joining us. As always, good day.